All right, what is up, everybody? My name is Jordan. I'm the head coach here at SaberSim, and on today's stream in this video, I'm going to be showing you guys how to beat MLB DFS in 2022. And before we get started, I just want to mention that this isn't going to be about how I pick my favorite plays on the slate or even what my favorite plays on the opening day slate are, or teaching you what buttons to press on your optimizer or your tools. I'm going to be teaching you the core strategies and the ways of thinking that you really need to know to build your unique winning process this baseball season. As we walk through this, I am, of course, going to show how SaberSim can simplify your MLB process. But really, this content, these strategies should apply no matter what tools you're going to use. And it all starts with ultimately building out a process. So what do I mean when I'm talking about a process? Really, that's the steps you're taking to play DFS every single night. And we've boiled this down really to three simple questions. What are you going to play? How are you going to build your lineups? And how are you going to react to the news coming out before and during the slate? And really, this all comes down to leverage. And I think in the DFS space, most people think about leverage as it relates to ownership. And that is definitely one way to think about leverage. That is a way to get leverage. But thinking about leverage more broadly, leverage is about getting the maximum impact, the maximum advantage from the minimal amount of effort. The more impact you get, the greater advantage you get. With the less effort, the more leverage you have. And the goal of your DFS practice, both for MLB, but really even more broadly speaking, should be getting as much leverage as you can in your process. Focus on high leverage actions. And we can boil that down even further. The first step is prioritize and specialize. You don't need to feel like you need to do every single thing you can think of when it comes to building a DFS process. Figure out where you can add the most value and specialize and work from that. And second, take advantage of other people's work, especially now in 2022. This is how to beat MLB DFS in 2022. There's a lot of great tools and research opportunities and other things out there that you can plug into your pipeline and figure out where you can jump in and start adding value. So let's go ahead and kind of jump in and talk about how we go about doing this. So we have three components of a DFS process, right? What am I going to play? How am I going to build my lineups? And how am I going to keep track of the news? So let's start with what are you going to play? Everybody always wants to start at building lineups, but this is a really important concept. And really what we're talking about here are bankroll management and contest selection. If you've watched some of our other videos, you know how seriously we take bankroll management and contest selection here at SaberSim. Really, no matter how good your lineups actually are, if you're not playing the right contests or you're risking too much on a given slate, it's not really going to matter. You're either going to minimize your ROI or you're eventually just going to go broke. So let's talk about bankroll management first. It isn't the sexiest thing, but it's one of the higher leverage things you can do. And if you get it right, you'll maximize the amount of profit you can make. So our recommendations for bankroll management overall for this baseball season, don't exceed more than 5% of your bankroll per day. And that's really a maximum. If you are comfortable playing less or more comfortable playing less, then play less. You don't want to exceed 5% because DFS, but especially MLB DFS, is a high variance game. Even if you are playing optimally, the best lineups are not going to win every single night. You need to tamper your amount of bankroll that you're putting in on any given slate so you can still be around, still entering contests and still giving yourself a chance to win when we get to July, August, and so on. As your bankroll grows and you're moving to higher stakes contests, maybe just staking more each night, but also moving to contests where there's a sharper field, a top heavier payout structure, it's perfectly fine to scale that down. In fact, it's probably recommended. But 5% maximum per day is going to be a very good baseline of the right amount of bankroll to play. Now let's talk about contest selection. There's three main rules that we talk about when we're breaking into contest selection. Stick to GBPs. Build as many lineups as you can and put them into the best contests. So sticking to GBPs is pretty simple. Don't play cash games. Cash games, especially in baseball, are essentially dead for really building a bankroll and finding an edge. And the main reasons why are that the fundamental cash game strategy as it relates to the payout structure is to just optimize for the average performance. You're paid out flatly. Everybody in the top 50% of a contest, more or less, whether this is a head-to-head, a 50-50, or a double-up, is going to double their money. And that means your optimal strategy is to optimize for average performance. Well, There are a lot of good average projections out there. There are also a lot of optimizers designed to build a cash lineup out there. And the edge of building a good average projection has gotten a lot smaller. But really, the main thing here is that there's just not enough recreational money, enough casual money in cash games to offset that. In GPPs, it's a lot harder to build a good high upside lineup that has win equity because the strategy is not as obvious. And we'll talk about what some of those strategies are here in a moment. But also, there's a lot more recreational and casual money in GPPs. Casual players are more enticed by the big prize pools, the opportunity to take down 100K on a given slate. So that's what they play, and that gives us a bigger overall edge. So in a nutshell, don't worry about cash, stick to GPPs. The content of this stream here is going to be focused mostly around GPP strategy. The next point, though, is to build a lot of lineups. And in fact, I would say build as many unique lineups as you can within that 5% bankroll recommendation. So this means if you have $20, for example, you should be shooting to build $21 lineups instead of one $20 lineup. And I think this is a little bit strange for people a lot of times the first time they hear this, because the implication is that you should be playing the MME contest, the max multi-entry contest, which wasn't really what was the common advice even just a few years ago. And the reason why this wasn't common advice just a few years ago is because building more and more lineups by hand or with more outdated tools is hard. In fact, each individual lineup that you're building was probably more work you had to put in. To go from 5 lineups to 10 good profitable lineups, you almost had to double your work, especially if you were building by hand. Well, now with higher leverage tools, better overall lineup optimizers, it's really not that much of a material difference between building 150 lineups and building one lineup. And that actually makes building a lot of lineups one of the highest leverage things that you can do. With very little additional effort, you gain a big impact, and that impact is smoothing out your variance. You give yourself a greater % chance to have a high upside lineup every single time you play DFS without having the additional time involved to create those additional lineups. So focus on playing as many unique lineups as you can in those GPPs while staying under the bankroll management principles that I just outlined. But finally, the last point here is to focus on playing the best contests. And really, no one appreciates how important this is. In fact, if you take away one thing from this entire stream, I would say probably take away this. Playing your lineups and really focusing on playing the best overall contests can literally double your ROI. I have seen it happen multiple times, dozens of times for SaberSim users. Elsewhere, it is a huge factor. And the main reason why this is important is because there is a different structure and there are different opponents in different contests. And by focusing on playing the contests that have the best overall structures and the softest opponents, you can increase the advantage you have. So here's the basics. Here's what I would recommend when you're looking at the contest selection. Focus on the contests that have the highest number of effective entrants. The effective entrants is the total number of lineups in the contest divided by the entry limit for any one person. So for example, a contest with 20,000 entries, that is a 20 max, has 1,000 effective entrants in it. That number essentially represents the unique number of people that could max that contest out if every single person playing the contest was maxing it out. It's the total, it's the minimum number of unique people that are actually playing that contest that night. And the reason why this is important is a contest that has the higher number of effective entrants is going to diminish the impact that the most skilled players in the lobby have on that particular contest, right? If you have 1,000 unique players and there's one extremely skilled player in there, even if that person has 150 lineups in the contest, they're only one of 1,000 unique people trying to build lineups and win that money, and their impact is diminished. If you compare that to, for example, a 200 lineup contest, that's a 20 max, that's really only 10 people. The impact that sharpest player has a big impact on the overall equity available in the contest. So focus on these contests that maximize the number of effective entrants first. But second, and this is really something that's unique to DraftKings and FanDuel because of the rules of those sites, but don't play any contests under $3 until you've maxed pretty much everything out below it. Players with $1 million or more in lifetime winnings can't access or play those contests at all. So the pool of available players to fill up the remaining lineup spots is a lot smaller. If you don't want to have to worry about how you're going to beat Giant Squid this baseball season, you can avoid him completely by focusing on those contests under $3. So in summary here of this kind of section here, 5% maximum bankroll invested per day. Don't play cash games. Play as many unique lineups as possible into the best GPPs, which are the ones under $3 if you have access to them. And once you've maxed them out, focus on the contests that have the maximum number of effective entrants. This is really important. You are essentially putting in no additional work because you have to enter contests anyway, but you are going to get a better result by putting them into the best contests possible. So let's start working our way here then into how we're going to build lineups, the more fun stuff. But before we actually pull up SaberSim or an optimizer or any tools up on screen, I want to talk about this from kind of a theoretical standpoint and talk about the first principles here. And when you're building GPP lineups, you really need to be asking and answering 3 questions. The first is, what kind of lineups are you building? What are you trying to accomplish in those lineups? How are you going to manage your risk across those lineups? And once you're playing more and more lineups, this becomes a pretty important factor. If you're playing as many lineups as you can, you need to think about how you're managing your risk across that portfolio. But then also, how are you going to build those lineups? And that's more about what tools are you going to incorporate for your lineup construction. So let's start here. What kind of lineups are we building? What do they look like for baseball in particular? Well, this comes down to really figuring out what it takes to win a contest. We need to build lineups that have raw scoring upside. They need to have enough raw scoring upside to finish above all the others in the contest. Simplest way of thinking about this, in a bigger contest, you're going to need to score more points to take it down. But you also want to figure out the lowest variance way to get there. Right? You don't want to just jam in a bunch of players that have a high theoretical upside. All of these guys, if they hit that 1% outcome that lineup's going to score, 300 points, you want to basically minimize your variance so that the probability of reaching that high upside score is high enough so the lineup altogether has a high expected value. That lineup has a high scoring potential and a relatively high probability of reaching that potential. So that combines into high expected value. And finding the balance there is really important. You don't want to take on additional risk in your lineups to score 270 if 240 points would have beat the contest, right? So how much this balance of lowering your variance and maximizing upside, where to find the right balance of those two things depends on really a couple factors. It depends on the payout structure of a contest. If you are financially incentivized to score very, very high in your contest, right, it makes more sense to accept a higher variance to get that higher upside score. Really top-heavy contests, you're going to want to accept a little bit higher variance overall. But it also depends on how likely somebody is to hit the perfect lineup, right, or how close somebody in your contest is to hitting that perfect lineup. When I talk about the perfect lineup, I'm basically referring to if you actually had the actual scores from the end of the slate, what is the optimal, essentially? And how close are people in that contest going to get to that? And that depends on a couple things. That depends on how many entries are in the contest, right? If there's more entries in the contest, just from a pure probability, the highest scoring lineup in the contest is probably going to get closer and closer to the perfect lineup. But it also depends on the size of the slate. As the size of the slate gets smaller, there's less players in the pool, and the chance of somebody basically stumbling on that perfect lineup is going to get higher and higher. Finally, the last thing that kind of comes into play here is ownership. The chalkier your lineup is, the higher that lineup needs to score because it will have a lot of competition with other lineups that share those same players. So if you're jamming in a bunch of chalk and basically just assuming that ownership is efficient, your lineup probably has pretty high scoring upside. A lot of times the chalk is generally the best plays. And it also is going to have a little bit lower variance because a lot of times those players are going to be lower variance, but those fantasy points will be shared with all of the other players in the contest or a lot of other lineups in the contest. So you don't really get that high scoring upside in terms of how you place into the contests. So I wanted to talk about this really from a standpoint of first principles and explain why I'm talking about some of this stuff. But let's talk a little bit about baseball specific, since this is a MLB DFS stream here, and talk about what the crossroads between a high upside and a low variance lineup looks like in baseball. And I'm basically going to do this with correlation. So good opportunity here then to get the app up on screen and talk a little bit about correlation. So when two players are positively correlated, we're basically saying that their outcomes move in the same directions. If one player does well, it means that other players are likely to do well. And there's a lot of correlation in baseball. There's really two reasons. And well, first of all, the players that are correlated in baseball are generally, for the most part, batters on the same team. And those correlations really come up for two different reasons. The first is that when you have a hitter or you have somebody at bat and that player gets on base, that stalls an out, basically. That means every single other player in the lineup is that much closer to their next plate appearance. By not getting out, a batter essentially lengthens the game or the amount of time that the hitting team has to hit and gives them more opportunities. Imagine if in basketball, is the more and more a team scored, the actual minutes remaining in the game also increased, or the scoring opportunities for the team increased, or the minutes available increased. That's essentially the impact. And that's the primary impact, actually, of why correlation presents in baseball. The second reason, and I actually think probably the more intuitive reason, is that there are combined scoring opportunities in baseball, right? You have a player gets on base and they score some points for getting on base, and then the next guy comes up and hits an RBI double. Well, you get the scoring opportunity, assuming those two players, you have both of those players, you get these points scored for the player that hit the RBI and the player that got on base and the run scored, and there's a combined scoring opportunity there. So overall, correlation is important in baseball because you are increasing your theoretical upside of these players, but you're also lowering the variance. You're increasing the probability of that particular lineup having success. Easy way to think about this is thinking about it kind of from a standpoint of flipping coins. If you were building a lineup of 8 uncorrelated players, you'd essentially be flipping 8 different independent coins and trying to get them all right. And really, actually, it's even harder than that, but that's kind of a good analogy of it. When you correlate your lineup, it's as if you were flipping less coins because the results of one player impact the other player by stacking players together, and one player has a good game, it increases the likelihood that the other players on that stack have a good game. The crucial point here, I think, is that this is ultimately going to lower the theoretical ceiling, though. There are almost always going to be 5 uncorrelated players from a random set of games overall that could have outscored your 5-man stack. So you're balancing the need to stack to reduce your variance, give you the better probability of having 5 players that have a big night, but lowering that overall maximum ceiling those players could score because there's likely to be a different 5 set of players that you could have played for the same salary that would have scored more. So what does this ultimately look like, kind of putting this all together for baseball? On a theoretical level, for smaller contests with flatter payout structures and bigger slates, right? Those were kind of the concepts I just talked about here. Contests, payout structure, and the size of the slate. We would want to stack more often and with bigger stacks. In bigger contests with top heavier payout structures and smaller slates, we want to at least kind of consider stacking a little bit less and with smaller stacks. So it's kind of complicated. There's a lot of moving parts here. In practice, right, the way I ultimately end up thinking about this for me, on FanDuel, you can stack 4 players together from the same team. On DraftKings, 5. So we can kind of break up our individual lineup constructions with a major and a minor stack, right? Your bigger stack and your minor stack. The way this ultimately ends up playing out on DraftKings, right? The biggest stack size you can make is 5-3. On FanDuel, you can make a 4-4. So on DraftKings, for example, your major stack would be a 5-man stack and your minor stack would be a 3-man stack. On FanDuel, 4-4 is balanced, but maybe you have a 4 major stack and a 3-man minor stack. So the most important thing that I think about here when I'm thinking about my stack sizing for baseball is ultimately the slate size, and mostly from the lens of how many uncorrelated players am I comfortable having. So on really big slates, like 10 plus games, I really probably only want maximum like one uncorrelated player. It's very unlikely, again, I want to kind of reiterate the point. It's very unlikely that people are going to find that perfect lineup, so we can rely on correlation to bring down our variance significantly, right? So on 10 plus game slates, FanDuel, probably 4-4s, 4-3s mostly. On DraftKings, mostly 5-3s, probably some 5-2s, maybe some 4-3 lineups as well. Kind of one uncorrelated player, one off in my lineups. In more medium-sized slates or so, 5 to 9, I'll probably allow maybe 1 to 2 uncorrelated players. So maybe I'll start to allow some of those 4-2 stacks into my builds. And for small slates, 5 or less games, I'm not as concerned with forcing particular stack sizes. I probably just want to make sure that I still have 1 4 type stack in most of my lineups here. The top heavier the contest I'm playing and the bigger the contest I'm playing, the more I'm willing to accept those stack sizes get a little smaller. But those are kind of the general rules of thumb I work with. So quite a lot going on here. We'll talk a little bit overall about how we can solve some of these problems, some of this complexity of how the right size of stacking is as we move along here. But for now, I want to move on to thinking about how we're going to manage our risk in our lineup. So first of all, it's important in DFS to diversify your portfolio by managing basically how much exposure you have to different players, because the game has high variance naturally. So if we think about NBA, right, you've got a starting point guard that's minimum price that's thrown into the starting lineup. If he's going to be on the court for 35 minutes, that player is probably going to soak up a bunch of fantasy points purely by opportunity, just being on the court. And their range of outcomes actually would imply that they have a pretty low risk of failure. In baseball, that is very, very different, right? A player can fail very easily, even if it is an elite hitter facing a terrible pitcher in a great hitting park. Anybody can go 0 for 4 at any time. And what this ultimately means, the impact of this, is that the expected value of different lineups for a bunch of different players included in them are all pretty close together. You'll actually see that in basketball, for example, it's very quickly financially a bad move to fade a player that is projected that well. But in baseball, a lot of the lineups at the top, because ranges of outcomes of players are so close together, are pretty close. So it makes a lot of sense to diversify your lineups. By diversifying, you get leverage in that process because you are virtually not decreasing your expected value at all. You have a negligible impact on your expected value, but you're spreading out your variance a lot. You're reducing your risk of having a total bad night or even a bad week by spreading out and reducing your risk. So overall, this does depend a little bit on how many lineups you are playing, but assuming that you're following our contest selection principles and playing at least 20 or so unique lineups on the slate, a couple rules of thumb that I like to follow here when I'm thinking about my diversification, my exposure management. And the first is I like to cap my pitching exposure at around 2x the field for pitchers, for 2x the projected ownership for pitchers. And pitchers are less variant than hitters, but there's still a lot of downside there. You can basically watch any pitcher go out and get lit up on a given night, even some of the best pitchers in the game. A lot of times, I don't like to be 2 times more exposed to any one pitcher than the field is. For hitters, a lot of times I will be capping my exposure to hitters to 30, maybe 40% on smaller slates. On bigger slates, I maybe even would be willing to go a little bit less than that. But we'll see here, and actually we can pull this back up here. For most hitters, their most common outcomes are actually going to be around 0 points, even excellently projected hitters, right? So if we pull this up, let's look at our best overall projected hitter here for opening day slate. Right now, at the moment, that's Pete Alonso on FanDuel here. His most common outcome, 29% of the time, is actually scoring 0 points. And he's probably going to show up in a lot of lineups. He's probably going to show up in a lot of lineups for a lot of people if projections overall kind of agree that we like the Mets on the slate tomorrow. But he's still failing, most commonly scoring 0 points in 30% of simulations. And this is basically why it is almost always to your benefit to diversify your hitters and to be somewhat cautious with your exposure management on the hitting side. Cool. So in a nutshell, we want a balanced portfolio of lineups that give us the highest upside results, the highest raw upside potential via the lowest variance route. So it's a very important kind of concept. I think on the exposure thing, really the way I like to think about it, the last note on the exposures is I like to think about it is what do I feel like is the probability that player shows up in the winning lineup for that contest? And intuitively, I like to think about matching my exposure to that value. So let's quickly talk about here, what do you need to actually go ahead and start building lineups? And the first thing that I think you need here is research. But I want to be a little careful about the way that I say that, because you often hear people talk about research and the importance of research in DFS, and especially baseball DFS. But a lot of the research that people talk about into a variety of things, different advanced stats, home and away splits, handedness splits, all of these different things, they are generally either already factored into the projections, or they're just something that's not predictive or helpful at all. So when you're thinking about your research, I want you to think about areas of things that you can research that are high impact, but also low effort. So I'm going to give you 3 of these that I like to look at most often. So the first is Vegas. So I want to pull up, I typically use this Fantasy Labs MLB Vegas dashboard here. They don't have opening day up yet. It's still a spring training day at the time of this recording here. And I know this is one of our competitors here, but I think this is a very simple tool of seeing implied totals for teams in a very quick and clean presentation. And what's really valuable about Vegas here is that they have a very solid set of essentially mean projections of what they expect each team to do, right? SaberSim does not use Vegas as a primary input. When we simulate our games, we kind of come up with our own team totals of our own simulations. But Vegas is a very good average mean projection that works as a bit of a second opinion when you're thinking about how you want to approach the slate. And I'll talk about some of the applications that I actually use Vegas for in my process here in a bit. But the other real benefit of thinking about Vegas, or at least doing a little bit of research to look at it, is it will give you a little bit of a better idea of what the field might do. Most baseball models are built using Vegas as a primary input, which means that in general, apart from some potential salary constraints or positional restraints of the way that lineups actually come together, the chalkiest stacks are generally going to be the highest projected Vegas stacks. The chalkiest pitchers are generally going to be the pitchers facing the teams that are projected for the lowest total. So it can be a really good tool as a way to quickly get an idea of what the field is going to do on the slate, but also kind of a second opinion of how the slate looks. And the main reason why I like this Fantasy Labs dashboard is that once we have this pulled up for opening day, it will have every team here in a very clean view. But you can find basically any tool that can kind of do this, or even just look directly at the sportsbook's odds yourself and get kind of an idea. But I think looking at Vegas can be a pretty low effort task that has a pretty big impact on my process overall. The second research tool that I wanted to bring up here, and I'll go into why weather is more important from a process standpoint in a second, but you need a very clean and clear and accurate way to know what games have weather risk on a given slate. So for that, I like to use the RotoGrinders Kevin Roth MLB Weather Report dashboard. So nothing here for opening day yet either. If you've been paying attention to the news here for opening day, you know that there are 2 games that have already gotten postponed, but this is a really clean view of games that have weather concerns, a very uniquely baseball concern. So it's another thing that I like to look at in my research process is the baseball weather. And again, we'll talk about in a minute here what I actually do with this and why weather is important, but it's another research tool that I really like to use. And finally, you need a news aggregator. So news is important in baseball. We'll talk about that here as well in just a moment, but I recommend using the Underdog MLB Twitter channel. This is basically aggregating news about weather and mostly postponements and things like that, but also starting lineups and scratches and things like that. All very important to make sure you're staying up to date on your overall news in baseball, right? You don't want to get left out in a situation where you're playing players that aren't playing or missed something that happened in the starting lineups because you don't have a pulse on the news, and you don't really need to go and try to follow all these different beat reporters or try to track this all down yourself. You can use an aggregator like Underdog here and get all of the news for yourself that way. So overall here, let me go ahead and bounce back to SaberSim. after, oops, there we go. Cool. Okay, cool. So apart from just research, the other component of how you're actually going to build your lineups is ultimately the tools. And the tools, there's a lot of different tools out there for how you're going to go about building your lineups, right? But the fundamentals you really need to be successful is you need projections, right? You need correlation information. We just talked about how basically correlation is kind of the primary opportunity or the edge that you have in your baseball lineups to marry the high probability or the high upside, high raw scoring upside with a high probability of success, right? It's crucial. You need that. You need ownership projections, right? I mentioned before, ownership ultimately impacts the rate at which a lineup is going to show up in the top percent of a contest. And finally, you need an optimizer. You need something that actually goes and builds those lineups. You can't survive without essentially those four things in baseball DFS. But I think we can take this one step further and kind of ask, what is a high leverage tool? What does a high leverage tool look like when you're building a baseball process? And I don't want to take it for granted that we're using SaberSim to do this video here today. So if you were trying to think about what is the highest leverage tool that I could use, what tool could I use where I get the highest impact for the lowest overall amount of effort? Well, you would want a tool that provided some of that data, the projections, the correlation information, the ownership projections in the most accurate way possible, right? And when I say accurate, I almost more mean specific, right? You want a tool that is going to give you a full picture of what is most likely to happen and how players are correlated and what the field is going to do most accurately. But you also want that optimizer to synthesize that information the most effectively. So if you have accurate projections, ranges of outcomes, correlation, and ownership data, but you have to tell the optimizer exactly how to go about interpreting those, you're going to have to put in a lot of effort, which is very low leverage. You may get a big impact out of that when you're actually done, but saying, here's all the inputs, the correlation, the ownership, and the projections, and here's exactly how I want that to do, that's very time consuming. That's a very low leverage way of doing things. And ultimately, SaberSim is a high leverage tool. So we'll talk about how this all works in detail in a moment. But because we're using simulations here to simulate baseball games play by play, we get the full range of outcomes of a player. You get the specific correlations of individual batters in that game as they're playing that particular day. You're getting ownership projections that are based on building thousands of real lineups that could get played and calculating the exposure to different players in those lineups. And you have a builder that can synthesize all those things together while keeping track of the contest and the contest context of what you're trying to build lineups for. So it's a very high impact for low effort tool that actually ends up dropping you into the MLB process very far along. And what you have left to do or where you can start adding value from there is much further along in the process. So overall, when you're thinking about your MLB DFS tools, it doesn't really have to be just all SaberSim, right? But look for tools that essentially do that. Look for tools that are helping you deliver the highest impact possible with the lowest amount of effort, because that's ultimately going to leave you with as much time and as much energy to add additional value. So before we kind of move on, I wanted to answer the last question here. And I kind of hinted at it a second ago, but this last question is, how are you going to react to the news? So in baseball DFS, there's really two kinds of news that are really going to be impactful on a given slate. And that is weather and lineup changes. So that kind of goes back to, why are two of the most important things that I think are part of my MLB research process, weather and news aggregation. It's because weather and lineup changes are the most important news that you need to keep track of. So let's talk about weather first. So weather can have a big impact on the slate. Nobody wants a zero in their lineup. So staying tuned in to what games carry weather risk is important to avoid that. We were, I would say, pretty lucky overall, even though it sucks to have opening day games canceled. We were pretty lucky that we got this news today. It definitely, as we go on throughout the season, there will be slates. There will probably be many slates where there is games with weather risk and risk of postponement that are happening right before lock, that are happening throughout the slate, right? When I'm talking about weather risk, there's really a couple different definitions. So the biggest risk is the game just getting straight up postponed, right? Every player in the game gets a 0. That's bad. You don't want that. But there's also other weather situations that can come up where maybe there's a risk of a delay, right? You have certain weather situations where, especially in the summer, in warmer climates down south, really, I guess everywhere in the Midwest too, you'll have on and off thunderstorms sometimes where there's a game that has a risk of getting delayed. Or you maybe have a situation where a game has a risk of getting shortened or something like that. And these can ultimately kind of have different impacts. Delays, in particular, mid-game delays, are very risky for pitchers. If a pitcher has gone out and thrown 3 innings and gotten all warmed up and has been playing in the game, and then the game gets delayed for a thunderstorm, right? A lot of times the teams won't put that pitcher back in. They don't want him to risk injury by going out, getting all warmed up again, and going back out into the game. Overall, these weather risks, whether it's postponement or delays or whatever, it's not something that I would say happens every single day, but is probably more weather concerns. There's probably more slates with weather concerns than not. There's definitely something that's happening at least probably a few times a week. So it's something that you need to stay focused on. It's something that needs to be a part of your process. How you want to focus on weather really depends a lot on how much time you have. And again, we don't have opening day information up from Kevin Roth yet. But I think really there's kind of a couple simple steps of what I think are the quickest ways to deal with leverage, or the highest leverage ways to deal with weather, the quickest ways to deal with weather. And then the ways that maybe if you have a little bit more time or want to spend a little bit more time on it, that I think you can kind of get a little bit more out of that. But no matter what, if Kevin Roth marks the game as red or orange red, that's essentially very likely to be postponed. I would just completely insta-fade that game. I would not even thinking about it. On the flip side, if a game is green, yellow, and generally yellow as well, you can probably just play it and not really think about it. So I guess to be clear, I should make one thing clear. Kevin Roth uses this color coding system of green, yellow, orange, red, and red. And as that goes from green to red, those games are more and more risky. This is such an important part of the way that I handle weather that I basically just think about baseball weather in general as this color coding system. I think it simplifies things quite a bit. But so anyway, green to essentially yellow, probably fine to play, always fade anything red or worse. But there's a little bit of gray area in between there. So if you've got games that are yellow-orange or orange, it may make sense for you to be potentially willing to play those games if they have really good plays in them, but capping your exposure to those plays to manage some of your risk. I also think you can consider the game start time a little bit here. If there's a game with weather risk, but there are good plays in it, and that game is not right at lock, you can include those players in your pool when you start building lineups, and then late swap away from them if the weather gets worse, or leave them in if the weather improves. As one of the important things about weather overall, it is chaotic a little bit. It's kind of random. So you can get this, you can get weather that changes pretty significantly and quickly. So that's twofold, really. Before the slate starts, you should be keeping track of this, right? It's not really enough to just check weather early in the day and be like, oh, these are the games I'm crossing off. These are the games I'm keeping in. Rain and thunderstorms and things like that can change pretty quickly, and it has a big impact on the slate. So definitely important to keep an eye on as you're going through lock, but also for games that are starting not right at the slate lock time. Weather can change, and especially, there's certain situations where maybe there's a game that has an elite hitting atmosphere, right? The hitters are going to be projected very well, but at lock looks terrible from a weather standpoint. And 2 hours later, that game looks pretty dry and they can play the game. You may have an opportunity to get on a team, on a game overall that has a great hitting environment that some of the field may be ignored because of the weather concerns. If you have more time and can afford to invest even more time into the weather research, you can actually, I think, even kind of go a little bit deeper than that. One thing that I will do if there is really an elite team that I really want to play and the game looks kind of crappy from a weather standpoint, you can check the team's social media accounts. And this is something that you'll gain a little bit of an appreciation for what teams you can trust a little bit more and what teams you can't. But sometimes teams will tweet or just generally kind of indicate that they intend to play a game. Boston is one that comes to mind. Games in Fenway often, I think, generally project as pretty good hitting environments. It's pretty good hitting park. Also a lot of rain there. The Boston social media team is pretty good about tweeting like, hey, we intend to play this game. We're going to delay it 2 hours or whatever, but we totally intend to playing this game. Washington, for example, on the other hand, is basically completely untrustworthy overall. And one, they don't really give you a lot of information, but two, they'll kind of just do whatever they want. It's a particularly chaotic team. So overall, the easiest thing to do is to just check Kevin Roth, blank all the games that have orange, red, play the games that have green, yellow. But as you have more and more time, I think you can afford to spend a little bit more time researching weather if the slate calls for it. So apart from weather, the other primary news factor here is lineup changes, right? A player, a lineup, a team resorting their batting order or having players that were not expected to be in the lineup that are, or players that were expected to be in the lineup that aren't. This is going to be a much smaller factor in terms of both the impact of this and how commonly it happens than something like NBA. So if you've been playing NBA all season and dealing with late swaps and things like that, you can take a bit of a exhale and know that this is a little bit of a lower impact, but it's still important. The reason this happens less commonly in baseball is mostly because teams get their starting lineups out a lot earlier. In fact, you'll typically have, I would say, starting lineups for most teams 2 to 3 hours before the game starts. I think by rule, they're supposed to have them out 3 hours before the start of the game. That's something that obviously not every team sticks to pretty religiously, but in general, you're not getting most starting lineups right before the game starts like you are in NBA. And second, the risk or the way that affects the slate when a player gets ruled out is a lot smaller. When a player gets ruled out or isn't in the lineup overall, the next player that's kind of coming in and batting instead typically has a pretty similar projection. And because that player getting ruled out does not create new opportunity for the other batters, right? The batters in the lineup are not now going to get 6 plate appearances instead of 4 because the best player on the team isn't in the lineup that night. That's how it basically works in NBA, right? The impact on the rest of the team is a little bit lower. And the impact on the slate is lower. You typically don't open up a ton of value plays on a baseball slate just because a really good player got ruled out. There may be a value play depending on the salary that comes in that opens it up, or depending on the player that comes into the lineup and opens up salary for that particular team, but it doesn't have like a slate breaking impact overall. So thinking about how you handle this and primarily how you maybe are late swapping after lock, at the very bare minimum, right? The number one thing you have to do is you should keep an eye out throughout the slate for confirmed lineups for teams that didn't have a confirmed lineup at lock. And you can actually, I think, kind of preempt this a little bit by when you get to the point of building your lineups, knowing which teams you have exposure to that didn't have a lineup out when you built your lineups, right? And kind of just keeping an eye out for those lineups as they come out throughout the slate. And again, the main tool I do to keep track of this, or the main tool I use to keep track of this, is this Underdog MLB Twitter account. They're very quick and very accurate with starting lineups and news for weather and things like this. But transaction alerts, and tomorrow we'll see, especially, we'll get starting lineups going on throughout the day here for opening day. So that's a tool I typically like to use for to do that. So bare minimum, if you have a player that's out in your lineups, you need to get them out, right? I think the easiest way to do that is to just put in the next overall best projected player or whatever that fits into that particular spot on your lineup in, right? For those that are familiar with SaberSim, and I'll kind of demo this here in a moment, that would essentially be quick swap, where you swap out player that's out for the next best overall projected player. If you have a little bit more time, again, if you can afford to put a little bit more effort into that, you can dig a little bit deeper. And I would say try to find a player that's on that same team as the player that was out. That will make sure that you maintain the correlations and the stacks of that particular lineup. But it's perfectly fine to just quick swap and get a player in there if you don't have a lot of time. And if you have a lot of time, or you can really afford to spend a little extra time on this, really, I think best practice is to fully late swap and rebuild your lineups that included the player that is out. So this is a little bit different than NBA. I don't think most of the time players getting ruled out impacts the slate enough that I want to rebuild everything, but you should late swap your lineups, meaning rebuild from scratch your lineups or not from scratch, but including the players who are already locked into that lineup. But you should rebuild it fully, taking into account the new projections and correlations that account for the new batting order, because there is an impact there. This requires a little bit of kind of nuance, I think. But if Matt Olson or something like that gets ruled out for the Braves tomorrow, just suddenly, right? That's going to have some impact on the overall Braves projection as a team, right? It won't have maybe an enormous impact, but it has some level of impact on the way that team is projected. And by rebuilding with an actual late swap build, you give your tools the opportunity to check essentially if it still wants to use the Braves stack in that particular lineup. So at least remove players that are out from your lineups. At best, you'll want to go in and probably run a late swap. So cool. All right, I see some questions coming in chat here. We will get to questions at the end. I'm going to kind of keep going here and really, in particular, start to incorporate SaberSim and putting this all together here in the SaberSim app. So as a summary of kind of what we've talked about here so far, really, you want to be building a process built based on leverage, right? And when I say leverage, again, that's meaning you're going to get the maximum impact possible for the minimum amount of effort. And SaberSim itself is a high leverage tool. It basically means it's going to be incorporating some of these high impact strategies into your process with minimal effort. So to walk through that and kind of show what I really mean here, I'm just going to go ahead and build some lineups. So we'll come back to step one and some of the things that I think you can do here to be effective on step one in just a moment. But let's build some lineups. So we'll click the build lineups here, right? And on step two, you're going to see the build settings. And I think it's just very important to talk about what's actually happening here on the build settings as it relates to what I was discussing before of what is really important to think about here. We are going to specify what contest we're playing, right? Style, hopefully GPP, the entry limit and the entrance, the overall size of the contests. And we will adjust these primary factors of success in baseball DFS, correlation, ownership, and variance in a way that is appropriately sized for the particular contest that we are building lineups for. So this is huge, right? We'll go ahead. I'm going to actually just start building lineups, but on a traditional optimizer or other tools or by hand, even accounting for these three things to the extent that is important for the contest and the slate that you're playing would essentially represent a process. Like, in fact, just taking the starting point of maybe you're working with projections, you have some ownership projections, and you have some understanding of correlation or some correlation data, and you're trying to get to the point, taking that to final lineups with a traditional optimizer or building by hands, that would essentially represent process and a process for somebody. And that is what has already kind of been automated here for you when you're building your lineups with SaberSim. And you can actually see that here when we get to step three and actually look at these overall lineups. So let's look at this real quickly here. And then we'll kind of talk about some of the ways that you can start to add value and think about this here. But with just setting the settings for what was a 20 max 10 to 50K entrance on FanDuel here, right? We are getting lineups that are stacked, right? Are they stacked exactly the way you want? We'll talk about that here in a second, but we have 4-3 stacks, 4 2s, 3 3s, 3 2s, 4 4s, 4 2s, right? We have exposures that are not, we are not all in on any one player, right? We have exposures here that maybe are not exactly the way that I would set this, and we'll talk about that here as well in a second, but we have kind of a moderate approach to exposures, and we have somewhat of a eye towards ownership, right? We are not just jamming all of the best overall projected plays. We are kind of coming at this from a moderate standpoint with the way that we're thinking about ownership, right? So I want to say that because I want to remind people that on any given slate, SaberSim essentially acts a bit as an advisor to you. It has a strategic component to the way that it is building lineups because it is thinking about these primary factors of the way of things that are important in your DFS process. And you shouldn't necessarily feel like you ever have to do things on SaberSim. And the things you are doing, you should be focusing on making the highest leverage actions as possible. You want to do things that are high impact for a minimal amount of effort. And a couple questions that you can ask yourself as you're building that process are, why am I doing these things? How good am I at doing this thing? And could I potentially outsource this? Is there somebody else's information that I could use to do this a little bit better? And also, how much time does it take to do this? Is it worth it, right? You will have more time in baseball season than you do in NBA to do things, to do stuff. But there is still a question of, is it worth you spending your time overall on whatever you're doing, right? I would say at the most basic level, one of the highest value ways that you can add value to SaberSim, if you don't want to do a lot of other things, is to basically make sure that you're giving it the most precise information of how to deal with the slate on your settings as possible, right? And that really comes down to building to the optimal slider settings. I know I've talked a lot here on stream before about if you're playing multiple contests in other sports to use a midpoint value for your sliders. If you are playing baseball DFS and you don't intend to add a lot of value to other parts of the process, because you'll have more time to build lineups before the slate starts in baseball, I think there's a pretty decent argument to be made to run different builds for your different contests you're playing, especially if the sliders are quite a bit different between them, to optimize this part of the process there, right? What I'm basically saying is that if you are not going to add value to your exposures or editing your projections in step one or something like that, I think you can actually get a little bit of a value add from just running separate builds and building your lineup separately and optimizing them for the particular contest you are playing. Beyond that, I think some of the highest value adds you can do and some of the most important things you can do in your SaberSim process here is to adjust your exposures here in step 3. So what happens when you do this, and something that I should say here, especially for those of you that aren't as familiar with SaberSim, is a lot of the work you do on SaberSim can happen after the lineups are built. And the reason why is because we are building a much bigger pool of lineups here than you actually are asking for. So in this case, I requested 20 lineups. The pool size is 500. I essentially have this playground of 500 lineups from which to work with, where I want to end up with 20, all of which are viable for the contest that I'm playing, right? These are all probably similarly expected value lineups. So you can safely start editing your exposures to manage your risk here in step 3, knowing that the lineups that come in to fill in that 20 are going to be generally probably just as good. And I think this is probably really one of the most important things that I would recommend doing as you're getting familiar with baseball. So I mentioned before, typically, tomorrow's actually, I think, a 7-game slate on FanDuel. Now, since the 2 games got postponed, I'm probably most interested at having, maybe 30% exposure, even amongst 20 lineups, 30, 35, 40% exposure to any one batter in the field, right? If we look at Starling Marte, right, looks like at the moment he's projected very well, very good average projection, but still fails 23% of the time. So one thing I will do here is I will go in and cap my exposure to some of these batters here to about 30%. And this isn't necessarily going to be the right answer for everybody, right? Different people are going to have a different approach for how they want to do this, for what your personal risk tolerance is. For some of you, it may not be worth really spending time on this at all. These exposures are going to be optimized already right off the bat for what we feel is appropriate for a particular contest. For pitchers, right? I had mentioned before that a lot of times I don't really feel the need to be more than 2x the field on a given pitcher. For very low projected pitchers, that can get kind of weird, right? I think 20% exposure to Adam Wainwright in this particular case is fine, but maybe I want to bring down my exposure to Scherzer, who also has some injury concerns. I actually don't even know if he's confirmed as the starting pitcher here for tomorrow, but maybe cap some of my exposures here overall. And again, SaberSim is going to do a pretty good job of getting this as close as possible for your particular contest that you're playing, but it's not going to be perfect. And you can add additional value based on your own particular risk tolerance for how you want to approach the slate. The other thing I think you can look at is the stacks, right? I mentioned before, for a 7-game slate, I probably want to make sure that I'm maybe kind of just leaving a couple, if any, uncorrelated pieces. I probably want mostly 4 stacks here. I can understand why we're getting some 3-3-2 stacks. That's definitely still a correlated build, but I want the bigger 4 stacks in my build. So I'm going to go ahead and zero that out here for my stack exposures here. So I replace that with a 3-2-2. I'm going to go ahead and zero that as well. And now we got a 3-3 stack. So now I'll go ahead and just zero that out as well. Okay, well, you get the point anyway. It seems to be, it seems like SaberSim, I guess, is at this point kind of insisting on the 3 stack, which is maybe just fine. Maybe that's okay. And I actually think that's actually a good point. Is a good question here to ask would be, why not do some of this ahead of time? Why not just say what kind of stacking rules do you want for this particular slate, or for max exposures? Why not just set max exposures ahead of the build? And I think the main reason why I typically like to do this way, and why I recommend people at least start this way, start with a build where you don't touch anything, is because it will give you a little bit of an indication of maybe what is viable, or something that you didn't really think about for that particular slate. I actually think, the proper response to kind of what we just saw happen here, really for me, probably would be to go look at some of these 3 stacks and think, why am I getting 3 stacks? Maybe there's a particular team that lends itself well to being 3 stacked, or it's a slate where there are some good looking one-offs or something like that, rather than forcing that stack rule in beforehand. Again, because SaberSim has an understanding of the correlations of individual players and the right amount to weight correlation for a particular slate, there is a strategic argument that it's making by saying, hey, maybe you want some 3 stacks, rather than it just being pure luck that you get here, right? So again, to summarize to where we are at this particular point, it's important to remember how much SaberSim is automating for you by keeping track of correlation and ownership and variance for your particular contest. And the easiest way to kind of visualize that is to just build lineups, to just run a build. I would say the first thing you probably should do actually here is just run a build when you sit down to build lineups for that slate, and see how things are looking, and that will help categorize maybe where you can add value from there. One of the best ways to add value from there is by adjusting your exposures, right? Match your exposures to what you are comfortable with your own personal risk tolerance for the slate. And if you don't have a sense of an intuition about what those exposures are when you first get started, I wouldn't worry too much about this. But as you kind of go through and play some slates throughout this season, you'll get an understanding of a little bit more of what the failure condition of some of these players looks like, how often that happens, and you'll get an idea of what exposure you want for particular players. From there, I do think you can start to get a little bit more creative about the way that you think about your strategy. And this is going to get into a little bit more of a advanced concept here, right? The important thing to remember is that SaberSim is essentially already advising on some strategic decisions. It's basically saying, what is the right way to build a correlated set of lineups while keeping an eye on ownership and the variance of players and the ranges of outcomes for my particular contest. But if you follow baseball DFS a little bit closer, or have more time to invest, or are just interested in kind of adding value in this particular way, you absolutely can. Really, there's kind of 2 ways that I think about this, right? There's some of the inputs to SaberSim. You may be able to add value to those, the projections, the ownership projections, etc. Or you may arrive at a different strategic decision based on what you've seen in your test build. So what I like to do here, this is kind of the way I approach this. And again, I won't be able to give somebody all of the answers of how you might do this for your process for the more strategic side of this here. But I want to give you an idea of some of the things that I like to look at, and also where I think the greatest spots to add value are when you want to make adjustments. So some of the things I like to do when I'm looking at a build, right, before I'm kind of deciding how I want to tackle the slate, is I like to look at the overall, what are my highest exposed players, right? What players am I getting the highest exposure to? But also, what are the highest owned plays, right? And am I getting positive or negative leverage on the highest owned plays? And I first want to generally think about this here from the standpoint of, do I agree with basically the assumptions here that are coming in? And how I will do that, a lot of this comes back to the Vegas research that I had talked about before, right? I want to make sure that the assumptions that are going into the system here in terms of what are the highest projected owned plays the highest owned projected on hitters and the highest projected owned stacks going to be, and making sure that that's generally kind of in line with what I think that the field is actually going to do. So as an example, this is the day before opening day. So a lot of this is probably still going to get dialed in. And I actually don't have as much of Vegas as a resource here to demonstrate this right now. But at the moment, these ownership projections look a little bit high for the Mets from what I am seeing is likely to happen. And it is a little bit strange to me here at the moment that given the ownership projections being as high as they are, that we have the Mets projected as high as they are, right? So one thing I might want to do is bring down the ownership projections for this particular team, and maybe bring down the team total as well. So when I'm adjusting ownership projections, a lot of times I like to think about things as maybe 20 to 20%-ish adjustments one direction or the other. You can kind of be somewhat flexible there. I think that's a good starting point. And you can always iterate again on that further. But just being directionally correct with your ownership adjustments, I think, is a really good approach. So the Mets popped out to me here as a team that maybe has a little bit of an over projection on the ownership. So I'm going to go ahead and just bring these down here, maybe like this. And I'm kind of just trying to be directionally correct again without worrying too much on the exact numbers that I end up at here. And I also feel like maybe there's a little bit of an over projection on the Mets overall. It seemed like there was a lot of exposure, especially given how highly projected they were to be owned in that build. So I'm going to bring their team total projection down as well. And two notes about this. First of all, when I'm adjusting team totals, I recommend that I typically stick to about a half of a run in one direction to start with. That'll still allow you to take advantage of the sims, maybe something our model is seeing about that game, but also leave a significant impact. And I definitely recommend adjusting the team total projections instead of the overall projections for each player in the game, because then your adjustments will be correlated. I think this is one of the coolest things about SaberSim overall, is that really if you are bearish on the Mets, like I am here at the moment, you are effectively actually a little bit bullish on Patrick Corbin, who is projected to pitch for the Nationals, at least at the moment. And by making the adjustment at the team total level, it will automatically account for that. Now I can go in here and probably run another build and see what we are getting and continue to iterate on that, maybe at that point by making just some adjustments in step 3 or potentially going back to step 1. Now, the point that I really want to make here is not necessarily that this is the perfect way to do this, but I think there is value to be added for those of you that want to do some additional research by looking at maybe some other sources and adjusting particularly the ownership projections and the team total. I think because ownership is leveraged so heavily in the build process, the ownership fade slider is going to be pretty high. And because adjusting team totals results in having a correlated change in your projections, that's some of the highest value adjustments that you can make to the inputs to the system. But I'd mentioned before that really there's kind of two ways that I think about my strategy of the slate. There is, do I think there's something maybe that the inputs are over projecting or under projecting, but also a different maybe strategic decision that I want to come to of the way that I'm tackling the slate, right? So I like to often think about my strategic decisions about what I want to do in terms of how I want to approach the slate, right? How I want to leverage ownership. Maybe I do a lot of that here in step 3. So, for example, maybe one thing that I want to do is particularly attack those Mets stacks. Maybe I want to leverage directly against those Mets stacks because I think that they're over projected at the moment, and maybe I think they're going to be over owned. One thing I may do there is go find Corbin. And bump up his exposure a little bit, just a tad, to get some exposure to him in my builds. And there we go. So on one hand, a lot of times I break my thinking up into step 1. I like to change the inputs if I think there's maybe something that from an input standpoint is wrong, or maybe I can add some value to adjust. And on step 3, I like to think about it more of the strategic decisions of how I'm taking that with me to attack the slate. Overall, the main point I really want to make here is that there are high leverage actions you can take by making adjustments on step 3 and step 1. And that ultimately where you want to leave your impact is going to be based on where you can add the most value and how much time and effort that you have willing to put into this. By no means are any of the things that I've just demonstrated here in the last 10 minutes or so necessarily particularly necessary. The lineups you are getting are going to be pretty good here already by default. This is a way to add additional value. And the one thing that you will find was kind of specifically missing from what I've described here is step 2. Apart from setting the build settings in step 2 to what your sliders are, what the default sliders are for your particular contest, I would not focus on step 2 heavily as a way to add value in baseball. The correlations in general are going to do a very, very good job of building you the right lineup constructions for that particular contest. There is a lot of information out there in the baseball DFS space that says build these exact stack types for your contests. A lot of that comes from a rule of thumb that's required that you need to build lineups by hand or using a traditional optimizer. But I spent a lot of time on this stream for a reason talking about why the combination of upside and lowering your variance with correlation is important and why that has certain importance for individual contests for a reason, right? I think correlation and correlation rules of thumb are generally pretty bad. And I think you should, in general, allow the strength of the builder to build you the right kinds of stacks that you need. So I would say if you have a very specific way that you want your lineups to look, it's okay to set a stacking rule. But I don't think this is a high leverage add for something that you should be incorporating into your process every single night. And that goes for player groups too. I think the builder is going to do a good job of grouping your players together automatically. So anyway, let's go ahead and go to kind of the final step of the process here and talk about the entry editor quickly here, right? So this is going to be how I'm going to get my lineups into my contests. And I also want to note here that this itself is a high leverage move. This is a high leverage way of getting your lineups into your contest because it minimizes the amount of time it takes to do this. And it reduces the risk of errors, and you can get your lineups into your contest much easier. So I'll go ahead and get these lineups in. And I think I only built 20, but I'm registered for 150 max, but that's okay. We'll just go ahead and put these in for now. And now I can download and upload. And I mostly wanted to do that to demonstrate this, particularly because this is how we're going to late swap. So the last note I wanted to make here is just how to go about late swapping. I talked about why you would late swap earlier, but I kind of want to talk about how you would do that now. So what I actually end up doing when I'm late swapping for a baseball slate is as I'm following those lineups where, as I'm following those teams whose lineups were not out when I built lineups, I will kind of keep track of when that news breaks. And then I'll go in and just double check and see if I have any players that have a 0 in my exposures. If I have exposure to a player that has a 0 in here, I think the easiest thing again to do is to go to quick swap and do an all out quick swap with the next best available player. And that will very simply download you a new entries file that you can upload to the sites. If I have a little bit more time, again, I will be specific with that. Instead of just swapping out, let's see, Nimmo is questionable at the moment. Instead of just swapping out Brandon Nimmo with the next best available player, I will go in and find somebody else for the Mets. I don't know who that person maybe hypothetically would be, and try to swap in that particular player. So in this case, that maintains my correlations, that maintains my stacks, and I think that's another easy way to do it. The final way of doing this here would be going into late swap and toggling on this particular toggle here that late swaps all your lineups that have that out player in it. This will take maybe a little bit more time to build, and you should know that this is going to fully rebuild those lineups, but I think this is kind of the most effective way and the best practice way of dealing with late swap here for your MLB process. All right, so overall, I want to do kind of a brief summarize everything I've talked about here. I know this ended up going quite a bit longer than I expected, but hopefully this was helpful. I want to give a kind of a quick summary, and then I'll jump over and answer the questions in YouTube chat. Thank you, everybody, for being very patient with me as I walked my way through this here. But overall, the key to beating baseball DFS this season is building a high leverage process that works for you. That means the things that you are doing at every single step in the process deliver the maximum impact with the lowest effort possible. What that ultimately means: manage your bankroll and maximize your ROI you can get out of the lineups that you're building with proper contest selection. Understand the core concepts that it takes to be successful in baseball DFS, right? It is finding the lowest variance route to upside possible, primarily through managing correlation and ownership. When you're researching, stick to high impact, low effort research. I wouldn't waste a ton of time diving super deep into, advanced stats and splits and things like that. Look at things where you can immediately take that research and add value. For me, and I would definitely recommend at the very least making weather and some kind of news aggregation a part of that for you. For me, the other thing I add in there is looking at Vegas implied totals, because I ultimately go on to use that to make some adjustments in step one to my team totals and my ownership. For you, that might be a different thing, but make sure that you find a way to collect your research and make it have as much impact to your process as possible with the lowest amount of effort. Use a high leverage tool that automates as much work as possible. And I do want to emphasize that this can be SaberSim. This can be SaberSim plus something else. This could be something that's not SaberSim, right? But try to find a tool that helps facilitate your process and delivers the biggest bang for your buck. And when it actually comes down to getting your hands dirty and doing things in your process, focus on adding value where you can with the least amount of effort, and that is best set to your skill set, right? I play a lot of baseball DFS. I've been playing baseball DFS for a long time. Part of the reason that I go in and adjust ownership and team totals based on Vegas is because I have a little bit of an intuitive sense of how to do that. If you don't, then don't do that. If you want to focus your time on really dialing in exposures, then focus more on that. If you want to spend your time making sure that you're building builds that are optimized for the particular contest you're playing, then build more builds. Build a process that works for you based on the concepts I've talked about here, based on your skill set and the time that you have available here. So before I answer questions, the last thing I just want to note here is that if you're watching this and haven't checked out SaberSim, we do have a free trial on our site, sabersim.com. You can come check us out for 7 days. I mentioned yesterday, it's probably the best week of the entire year to check us out because we have baseball, but we also have the Masters tomorrow. We have MMA, we have NASCAR, Formula One, NBA is still going on. We have all kinds of different sports to play. So definitely come check us out. And if you are interested in looking into a little bit more of our baseball content, I should call out our other baseball videos on our YouTube channel. So we have 2 other streams that we've done as we've gotten ready for the start of baseball season. They are now right at the top of our YouTube channel here. A video where I talk to Matt about overall high-level baseball DFS strategy, and a video where I talk to both Matt and Will about what goes into our simulations. So I definitely recommend checking those out. With all of that said, let's get into some of these questions here. Appreciate everybody watching. I actually have quite a viewer count here, so awesome to see that. Let's go ahead and answer some of these questions here. So Nitin said, wanted to ask what would be the right players to select based on SaberScore. So SaberScore is it's a good question here. Let's talk about that a little bit. So SaberScore really is a well, we'll give this a second to pull up here. And I should probably have a quick drink of water as well, because that was quite a marathon of talking here. Okay, so SaberScore is our attempt to quantify the expected value of a lineup based on the correlation, the ownership, and the variance of the players that are in that individual lineup. It quantifies the expected value. We're essentially ranking the lineups in your pool from best to worst. I think it is a very good tiebreaker in terms of determining what lineups to play, but I would not overly focus on making sure you're always playing the maximum number of SaberScore lineups you can. So, for example, right, if I go in and say 65% exposure to Juan Soto is too much exposure to a hitter for me and cap his exposure at 30%, that is in effect going to fill in new lineups that have a lower SaberScore than my original 20, but I wouldn't worry about that. Right? Make your adjustments to your SaberScore, to your lineups in step 3 as you see fit to manage your risk or to make strategic decisions. And then once you've done all that, allow SaberScore to decide what the best overall lineups to play are. So. Cool. Let's see. Jamie says, are the sliders in FanDuel optimized for FanDuel, or the slider settings based on backtesting DK slates only? That is a good question. I believe we handle these independently, that the sliders are independently tested. I will have to follow up on that. I would assume that there is not a significant difference in the optimal sliders of what is optimal on an individual site basis, because the core strategies are really going to be the same. It is not as if correlation is less or more important because of the site you're playing on. So I guess I will say I'm not confident that the backtesting has been done perfectly independently between these two sites. But I wouldn't expect a significant change even if it was. So Braden says, is 0-0-10 good? Referring to 0-0-10 sliders. When you're building your lineups, that you intend to play, I would play the default sliders for that particular contest. The 0-0-10 sliders, I think, can be very useful as a tool of how to, this can be useful as a research tool. I've talked about this as a research build before. This will essentially take a single slate simulation and build the optimal lineup. So when we were talking earlier about perfect lineups and optimal lineups and how likely players in your contest are likely to hit those optimals, this kind of build will build you those optimals, which can be useful as a research build. I will probably end up talking about research builds a little bit more in a different stream. But I would focus on the default sliders for your contests. T said, I know it varies slate by slate, but is it better to pay for a better pitcher or a better team stack? Would you ever let your one-off face a pitcher in your lineups? Thanks. I would only play a batter against an opposing pitcher in slates that are probably 2 games or less. Well, not less, because there is no less. That's a showdown. Probably 2 games, maybe 3-game slates, I might consider it. By default, this toggle on SaberSim will be off. Allow batters versus opposing pitcher. This will be off. And it will come on automatically on slates where we think it's appropriate. I typically just follow this. I don't think about that too much. If this comes on by default for a particular slate, I'll let it stay on, but I don't think about that too much. And then better for pitchers or team stacks. Honestly, I handle that on a slate by slate basis by looking at what I'm getting when I run my initial builds for that particular slate. There are going to be slates where it really makes a lot of sense to play a high-priced pitcher. There are going to be slates where you can get value at pitchers. On DraftKings, where you play 2 pitchers, sometimes you're going to have slates where there are 2 elite aces in a lot of your lineups. Others where you have 2 value plays. I would say, I don't think it's better to do one or the other. I would say, because I am pretty cautious with my exposures to different hitting stacks, period, a lot of times I end up naturally with a more... It is typically... I'm trying to think about the right way to say this. I'm typically so spread out on my team stacks overall that the diversity of my lineups are pretty diverse. I don't end up with, even if I really like a really expensive stack, I'm maximally going to be invested into them, probably in 30% of my lineup. So it's not as if there's a consistent rule of thumb for me, even within a given slate. Hopefully that kind of makes sense. AK Knowledge said, love the way Jordan breaks down SaberSim and sports to a science. I hope this was helpful. This was kind of a new approach to doing these for us, for baseball in particular. I really wanted to kind of bring things very back to first principles and talk about why these different things are important first before we just got to SaberSim and building your lineups and do this. So hopefully it was helpful. Larchar said, not sure if I heard, but is the weather report free? Yeah, that is free. This MLB weather report on Roto-Grinders. Clay said, how do you cap your pitcher on hitter on SaberSim? Do we have to do it manually? I'm a little confused. The easiest way to cap your exposure to pitchers and hitters is to do it here on step 3 in the maximum exposure column. So, maybe you want maximum 30% Scherzer. You can do that here by making that adjustment. Scorpion had asked about SaberScore as well. Hopefully that last kind of answer to that was helpful. David said, so I'm just getting into baseball DFS. What would you recommend? I would recommend watching this video if you didn't catch the whole thing here from start to finish. It's a long one. I intended this to be a little shorter. I think it is our plan to re-record this, not live on stream, but as kind of just a recorded video and put out a shorter version and put this out on YouTube. So we'll probably be getting out in the next couple weeks. I would say if I could simplify everything I talked about here today and just give you basically the cheat sheet of what to focus on, I would say 5% of your bankroll maximum on a slate, play that in GPPs only, no cash games, and play that in the contests that you can play that into contests that are under $3 with as many unique lineups as possible. Then when you're building lineups on SaberSim, I would say focus on setting your settings to the level that is appropriate for the contest, right? And then in step 3, after your lineups are built, manage your risk to what you think is what you are comfortable with for that particular slate, right? Obviously talked about a lot more here on today's stream, but I think that's like the basic, the very fundamental spark notes here of what's going on. And the main reason why I can say that again is because SaberSim understands here, SaberSim understands correlation and ownership and variance intuitively. So a lot of those things that you would have to do to be successful in the sport if you were building by hand, you don't have to do here. So Chase says, on a typical slate, how many player projections do you edit? On a baseball slate, I don't think it's necessarily fair to say that there's like a typical amount of editing that I am doing. There are slates, there is none. There is slates where I tweak almost every team projection. And again, most of the time that's going to come from me seeing a discrepancy between how SaberSim is projecting a team, how chalky I think that team is going to be, and how Vegas is projecting that team. So as not really, I think this is actually kind of the perfect example of, this isn't so much about how many, right? Like if I told you 4, I don't know how helpful that would be. I would think instead, if you want to add value by making adjustments to team projections, which is actually, again, I should note, I don't make a lot of individual player projections. I mostly work on the teams for baseball. I think that's more helpful. Instead of saying, I want to make 4 adjustments to teams on this slate, I would ask yourself, what are you trying to do? Right? Kind of going back to some of those questions here. What are you trying to do? Is there a way that you can add that value in a quicker way elsewhere in the process? And like, what tools can you use to help you get there? For me, it's generally running a test build and comparing that to Vegas and seeing maybe where I'm seeing some discrepancies. But it's not about I'm always going to update 4 teams. So Joe said, do the simulations for MLB incorporate weather? Thanks. They do. So they incorporate temperature and wind direction, and I think the humidity as well. I may have to check about that last one. But yes, weather beyond just the weather risk of a game, right? Weather does impact the projections in baseball quite a bit. So we do keep track of that. That's a very important factor, especially at particular parks. So definitely something that is included in the simulations here. All right, cool. Brendan had asked a good question here, actually, about, this was from Slack. So I'll paste this one in here. He said, what about 200 times 10 cent lineups? How do I know when to stop? The SaberScore? That's a great question. As you start branching out into these other contests and you're trying to maximize the number of lineups you have in play for a particular slate, I think there's a couple questions to ask. The first would be, if you're putting a unique lineup into every contest and you're playing 200 lineups, for example, in dime contests, I think it is worth asking yourself, can first place in any one of these contests at least pay off my entries fee for that particular slate? I think that would probably be like my final line. In this case, you'd be playing $20. And I think the maximum payout for any of those is $10. That's probably, for me, too many. I wouldn't want to play. I wouldn't want to, even though you could theoretically like take down multiple different contests with different unique lineups, I probably wouldn't want to play that many unique lineups at that point. I think that's a good rule of thumb. I also typically, for me, once I start entering a 150 max, which on FanDuel that happens really quickly, you can play the 150. You can play the pooch punt, or not pooch punt in football, whatever it is. I can't remember what it's called. The 5-cent 150 max. That's only $7.50 to max enter. A lot of times I don't like to play more than 150 total unique lineups once I've got 150 in play. So if I'm already playing 150, I'll use that and I will fill that as uniquely as possible into the set of lineups I'm playing. But I typically don't end up building more than actually 150 unique lineups for that particular slate, even if I'm playing 500 entries. I think the play as many unique lineups advice really is for people that are taking $50 and playing that into 3 lineups, 1 lineup, when they could spread that into 80. If you're already comfortable with max multi-entry and playing 150 maxes or playing 20 maxes and building these into multi-entry contests anyway, you're probably already doing what we kind of want you to do. It's really twofold. It's like play the lowest stakes first before moving up, which is naturally that's naturally going to spread you out into other contests, but also play in a way that gives you as many unique lineups as possible, right? So like if you have $50, use that in a way that spreads that out as much as possible. So, okay. I see a couple other questions in chat here. They're not about baseball, so I will either get you kind of a quick comment in Slack, or maybe we'll just start with these questions on tomorrow's stream here, because it's been a busy one on today already. Appreciate everybody that tuned into this here. Enjoy opening day tomorrow. We'll be live on stream probably right in the middle of opening day. At least I think there'll be some games on by the time that stream starts. Hopefully this was helpful. If you have any feedback for this format of a stream or of a video, I'd be happy to hear it as well. If you have any questions about anything we covered as well, feel free to comment on this video. You can DM me in Slack. You can send me a message on Twitter, or you can email our support team, support@sabersim.com. But otherwise, thank you. Good luck. Enjoy this baseball season, and we'll talk again here tomorrow. Cheers.